I stood on the courthouse steps in Prescott County on the second Tuesday of September and watched a stranger buy my ranch out from under me for a sum no sane man would pay for land that had not turned a decent profit in 3 years. And I want to tell you plainly that my first feeling, God forgive me, was not gratitude. It was fury. I had spent the whole of that summer convincing myself I could lose the Circle W with my dignity intact, provided I lost it to a fair price and a stranger's indifference. And instead, I lost it to a fair price and a stranger's kindness, which turned out to be a far harder thing to forgive. I remember the exact heat of that morning, the sun already high enough by 9 o'clock to bring sweat to the back of my neck under my collar, and the particular indignity of having half the county gather to watch a widow lose everything, the way people gather for any spectacle, whether they mean unkindness by it or not. If the bank's auction closed that morning without a bid higher than Jasper Coyle's, I'd walk off that courthouse lawn owning nothing but the clothes on my back and whatever I could load into a borrowed wagon by sundown, because Jasper Coyle did not buy ranches to run 'em. He bought 'em to strip the cattle, sell the water rights separate from the land, and let the buildings rot until some other fool wanted the acreage cheap enough to try again where I had failed. The note on the Circle W had been called due at $412, a debt carrying interest of 9% that Samuel had taken on the winter before he died to buy breeding stock meant to rebuild our herd after a hard drought year. A debt that had seemed like reasonable optimism at the time, and had become, after his death and 2 more dry seasons, a slow arithmetic of loss I could not outrun no matter how carefully I rationed feed or how many hours I spent in the saddle instead of at rest. I had watched Coyle do exactly what I feared to 3 other outfits along the Verde in the 2 years since Samuel died, and I had promised myself, standing in that same courthouse crowd the day they auctioned off the Hendricks's place, that I would rather burn my own barn to the ground than watch Jasper Coyle's crew do to my land what they had done to the Hendricks's.
The auctioneer opened the bidding at $400, a figure meant to cover the outstanding note and little else, and Jasper Coyle raised a gloved hand almost before the number had finished leaving the man's mouth, the way a man bids who has done this often enough to have stopped feeling anything at all about it. I remembered a particular sound of that courthouse crowd: low murmurs, the creak of the wooden steps under shifting boots, a dog barking somewhere down the street, all of it strangely distant, as though I were watching my own life auctioned off from behind a pane of glass. Nobody else in that crowd had the means or the appetite to challenge him, not after the drought we had all just weathered, and I stood at the edge of the courthouse lawn with my hands folded tight in front of me, watching the sale of everything Samuel and I had built together get decided by a man who had never once set foot on our land. I did not recognize the voice that raised the bid past Coyle's the first time. I turned, along with half the crowd, along with the sharp murmur that went through the onlookers at the unexpected challenge, to find a man I had seen only twice before in town, a traveling blacksmith who had set up a temporary forge behind the livery that spring and mended half the broken plowshares and horseshoes in the county before moving on toward the next settlement, or so I had assumed he meant to do. I remembered him vaguely from the one occasion I had brought a wagon wheel in for repair. A quiet, methodical man who had charged me a fair price and said perhaps a dozen words the entire time, none of them wasted. His name, I would learn within the hour, was Thaddeus Reed, and he stood at the back of the crowd in his work coat, hands in his pockets, as calm as a man discussing the weather, and he raised Jasper Coyle's bid by $50 without so much as raising his voice.
What followed was the strangest quarter hour of my life, a bidding war between a land speculator with money to spare and a blacksmith whose only visible assets were the tools on his cart, climbing past $600, then past $7, numbers that had no honest relationship to what my ranch was actually worth on the open market. The crowd growing quieter and more attentive with every exchange, Mr. Whitfield himself leaning forward from his place near the auctioneer's stand with an expression I could not quite read at the time, until Jasper Coyle finally shook his head in open disgust and dropped out at $740, nearly double what the note itself had called for, muttering something about fools and their money loud enough for half the courthouse lawn to hear. I confronted Thaddeus Reed before the auctioneer had even finished the paperwork, crossing the courthouse lawn with my skirts gathered in one fist and my temper barely held in check, the dust of the lawn already working its way into my boots, and I did not thank him. I asked him, in a voice sharper than I meant it to be, what exactly he thought he was going to do with a failing cattle ranch, given that a blacksmith's cart and a leather apron were not, to my knowledge, tools a man used to run 400 head of cattle through a drought. A small crowd had lingered to watch the exchange, and I remember being distantly aware of them, of Mr. Whitfield hovering nearby with his ledger, of Jasper Coyle already climbing into his buggy with a face like curdled milk, though none of it mattered nearly as much in that moment as the plain, furious confusion of a woman who had just watched a stranger spend a fortune on her behalf without asking. He told me, with the same unhurried calm he had used to outbid Coyle, that he did not intend to run it at all, that he had a smithy he'd been saving toward for 6 years in a growing town 2 territories east, and that he had just spent every dollar of that savings on land he had no interest in keeping.
I did not understand what he meant. Not fully. Not that afternoon standing on the courthouse lawn with the whole town watching us argue, my anger still too hot to let any of his explanation truly land. I understood it 3 days later, when he rode out to the Circle W uninvited, found me mending a section of corral fence with more force than the task strictly required, still working through the strange mixture of gratitude and resentment his purchase had left in me, and explained, as plainly as he had explained everything else that week, that territorial law allowed the original owner of a foreclosed property a full year to repay the sale price plus interest to whoever had purchased it at auction, and that he had bought my ranch not to keep it, but to hold that year open for me, because Jasper Coyle would never in his life have granted me the same courtesy. I should tell you now why the ranch mattered to me in a way that went beyond simple stubbornness, because a woman who fights this hard to keep a piece of dry Arizona rangeland deserves to have her reasons understood rather than assumed. Samuel and I had built the Circle W together from almost nothing. 5 years of hauling water and stringing fence and losing more calves to coyotes than either of us liked to admit. Arriving with little more than a wagon, a small herd, and a stubborn shared conviction that this particular stretch of dry country could be made to yield something worth staying for. He had died on that land, thrown and trampled during a spring gather when a rattlesnake spooked the herd, not 200 yards from the house we had built with our own hands, the two of us notching every log ourselves because we could not afford to hire it done. I had buried him under the cottonwood by the creek, the only tree on the whole property that gave real shade, planting a small ring of wildflowers around the marker that first spring because I could not bear to look at bare dirt every time I rode past, and I had told myself, standing at that grave with the whole ranch suddenly mine alone to run, that I would sooner die on that land myself than watch it pass to a man like Jasper Coyle who saw nothing in it but numbers. I did not know what to say to that. I still do not, fully, all these months later, though I have had a great deal more time to consider it. Thad's offer, once I understood it fully, should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt for the first several weeks like an unbearable debt of a different kind than the one the bank had held over me. A debt measured not in dollars, but in a kindness I had done nothing to earn and did not know how to repay.
I told him plainly, standing at my own corral fence with his horse tied nearby, that I did not want charity, that I had spent 2 years since Samuel's death making certain no one in this county mistook me for a woman who needed rescuing, standing straighter at every church supper and every stock sale, specifically so no one would offer help I had not asked for, and that his generosity, however well-intended, felt uncomfortably close to exactly that. He did not argue with me the way I expected him to. He told me in that same even voice that he had not done it to rescue me, only to buy time, and that what I chose to do with that time was entirely my own business and none of his. His horse shifted its weight beside us, tack creaking softly in the quiet, and I remember noticing, even in the middle of my own indignation, how remarkably still he stood himself, as though nothing about the conversation cost him any effort at all. He said he intended to work the smithy trade in the county seat for the length of the redemption year, regardless of what I decided, and that if I wanted his help running cattle in the meantime, he would give it honestly for honest wages, and if I did not want his help at all, he would simply hold the deed quietly until the year ran out and I either redeemed it or did not, and either way, he would not trouble me with his opinion on the matter. I want to be honest about how long it took me to trust that particular promise. Pride, once it has been the only thing standing between a woman and complete collapse, does not loosen its grip easily, and for the better part of 2 months I treated Thad's presence on my own land with a wariness that, looking back, he bore with far more patience than I deserved, patience that must have cost him something too, though he never once let it show in his manner toward me. I found small ways to keep the arrangement transactional in my own mind, insisting on paying his wages in cash rather than trade, refusing to let him take meals in the house those first weeks, though he worked from sunup past dark most days, thanking him with the same clipped courtesy I might have shown any hired hand. He rode out most mornings after his forge work in town, mended what needed mending, moved cattle when the season called for it, worked through more than one blistering afternoon without complaint, and asked for nothing beyond fair wages and a place to water his horse. And slowly, the way ice thins before it breaks rather than all at once, my wariness began to wear down into something closer to gratitude. And gratitude, given enough quiet mornings working fence lines side by side, began to wear down into something else again. The dark turn in this story came not from Thad at all, but from Jasper Coyle, who had not forgotten losing that auction and had no intention of letting the matter rest. He came to see me himself in late October, driving a fine buggy up to my own gate with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wants eventually, dressed as always in a suit far too fine for the dust of a working ranch, his gold watch chain catching the afternoon light as though he wanted it noticed, his boots polished to a shine that had clearly never touched a cattle pen in its life. He informed me, with a courtesy so thin it barely disguised the threat beneath it, that he had purchased the note on 3 other struggling outfits bordering mine, and that he intended, over the coming year, to consolidate enough surrounding land that the Circle W would find itself entirely landlocked, unable to move cattle to water or to market without crossing acreage he now controlled, unless I sold to him directly, at a price considerably lower than what Thad had paid on my behalf. I told him as evenly as I could manage that I had a full year to redeem my own land and intended to use every day of it, my voice steadier than I actually felt in that moment. And he smiled the particular smile of a man who has heard defiance before and watched it curdle into desperation soon enough, a smile that did not reach his pale, watery eyes at all. And he told me, almost gently, that a year was a very long time to hold a grudge against simple economics, and that he would be waiting whenever I came around to seeing sense. I did not tell Thad about that visit for nearly a week, some old habit of shouldering trouble alone still stubbornly intact even after everything, telling myself I could handle Coyle's threats the same way I had handled everything else since Samuel died, quietly and without help. And when he finally learned of it, from Mr. Whitfield at the bank rather than from me directly. He came to the ranch angrier than I had ever seen him, though his anger, true to his nature, expressed itself as an even greater stillness rather than any raised voice, a tightness around his jaw and a flatness to his words that told me more than shouting ever could have. He asked me, quietly, why I had not told him, and I did not have a good answer beyond the plain truth that I had spent so long being the only person responsible for this land that the habit of carrying its troubles alone had outlasted my actual need to. What followed was the hardest stretch of that whole year, weeks of watching Coyle's men survey the boundary lines of the ranches he had bought, driving stakes and stringing new fence wire close enough to our own that Thad and I both took to riding the perimeter most evenings just to be certain nothing had been moved onto Circle W ground itself. The two of us often finishing the ride in near total darkness, guided more by memory of the fence line than by any actual light. And weeks of Thad riding into the county seat after long days of forge work to quietly research water rights and easement law at the county recorder's office, determined to find some legal footing that would keep Coyle from landlocking us before the redemption year ran its course. He came home some nights with his eyes red from lamplight and old ledgers, saying little beyond a brief report of what he had or had not found, the smell of the county archive's old paper and dust still clinging faintly to his coat, and I began, without quite meaning to, setting a plate for him whether he had said he would stay to supper or not, a small habit that told me, more honestly than any conversation could have, exactly how far my own guard had already fallen. I use the word us now without hesitation, though at the time I still caught myself resisting it, some part of me still convinced that accepting a partnership, even one built on nothing more than fence mending and quiet suppers, was its own kind of surrender.
The turning point came in December, on an evening cold enough that we had taken to sitting close by the stove rather than out on the porch, the wind rattling the shutters and a pot of coffee going lukewarm between us, when Thad finally told me the whole truth of why he had spent 6 years' savings on a piece of land he had no intention of keeping. He said his own mother had lost a small farm in Missouri to a foreclosure auction not unlike mine, sold out from under her by a speculator no different from Jasper Coyle, while Thad was too young and too poor to do anything but watch, 12 years old and standing at the edge of their own dooryard, while strangers loaded her belongings onto a borrowed wagon because there was no money left to move them any other way. His mother's face, he said, holding an expression he had never once seen on her before or since, something between grief and a kind of grim, silent endurance he had spent the rest of his life trying to understand. He said he had carried the memory of her face on the day the wagon came to move them off land she had worked for 15 years, like a stone in his chest ever since, a stone he had never once, in all his years of drifting and saving and forging horseshoes in one dusty town after another, found a way to set down. He said watching me stand on that courthouse lawn, refusing to cry in front of a crowd that half expected me to, had put him in mind of his mother in a way he had not braced himself for, standing there among strangers with his tools still packed on his cart, half wondering if he had any business intervening at all, the two images overlapping in his mind so completely that for a moment, he admitted, he had nearly walked away rather than bid at all, uncertain whether he was helping me or simply trying, 15 years too late, to help a woman who no longer needed it. He said the bid he raised against Coyle had less to do with any particular feeling for me and more to do with a debt he owed his own memory, a chance to do for one stranger what nobody had been able to do for his mother. He said this without any self-pity, the same way he said everything, and I understood, hearing it, that his kindness toward me had never really been about rescue at all. It had been about repayment of an old grief neither of us had asked to carry. I told him then, because it finally felt safe to, about the morning I found Samuel's hat on the corral fence 3 days after his funeral, still hanging exactly where he'd left it,
the brim already gathering a fine layer of dust that I could not bring myself to wipe away, and how I had not been able to move it for nearly a month, certain that touching it would somehow make his absence more permanent than the burial itself had already made it. I told him about the way the house had felt those first weeks, too large and too quiet, every creak of the floorboards at night making me startle half awake, expecting to hear his boots on the stairs. I told him about the particular loneliness of running 400 head of cattle with nobody to argue strategy with over supper, and about how the hardest part of grief, for me, had never been the missing so much as the silence where conversation used to be. Thad listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, his hands wrapped around his own cooling coffee cup, and when he finished, he said quietly that he had noticed I had started arguing strategy with him over supper more often than not these past few months, and that he had taken it, rightly or wrongly, as a good sign. Spring came, and with it the anniversary of the auction drawing steadily closer, and with it also, unexpectedly, a solution to the landlock threat that neither of us had fully anticipated. Mr. Whitfield at the bank, sympathetic in his own quiet institutional way, discovered an old easement recorded decades earlier, granting the Circle W right of passage across what was now Coyle's western boundary, a document so old and so buried in the county archive that even Coyle's own lawyers had missed it when they drew up his purchase agreements, filed in a ledger from before the county courthouse itself had burned and been rebuilt a decade prior, the kind of paperwork most clerks would never have thought to search for at all. Thad had spent 3 separate evenings at that recorder's office over the winter, precisely because he suspected something like it might exist, working by lamplight through ledgers so old the ink had begun to fade, and finding it, at last, felt less like luck and more like the reward of a stubbornness I had come to recognize as entirely his own particular kind of love. Coyle, when informed of the easement, did not take the news well and made one final attempt to pressure me into selling before the redemption year closed, riding out himself with his usual practiced confidence. An offer dressed up as generosity that was, on close inspection, barely more than what the original banknote had called for, his usual polish showing its first real cracks as he laid the papers out on my kitchen table and pressed for a signature before I had even finished reading them. I told him, standing at my own gate, with Thad silent but present beside me, that the Circle W was not for sale, had never truly been for sale, and would not be for sale so long as I had breath left to argue the point. I did not cry in front of him, though the effort of holding myself steady cost me more than anyone watching that day could have known, and I watched something in his face curdle from confidence into something closer to defeat as he gathered his papers back into his case and turned his fine buggy back down the road, and did not return. I waited until his buggy was well out of sight before I let my shoulders drop even slightly, and even then only for a moment, before Thad's steady presence at the fence beside me reminded me that I was no longer standing entirely alone against men like Jasper Coyle, whatever my old habits still insisted otherwise. I redeemed the ranch in full on the anniversary of the auction, walking into Mr. Whitfield's office with the exact sum Thad had paid a year before, plus the interest the law required, dressed that morning in the same rust-brown riding skirt I had worn the day of the original auction, a small, deliberate choice on my part that Thad noticed and said nothing about, only smiled faintly as we rode into town together. Counted out in careful stacks the night before at my own kitchen table, with Thad sitting across from me, double-checking the arithmetic, though we both knew I had gotten it right the first time, the lamp burning low between us and a light rain tapping steadily against the window. Money I had earned back through a hard winter of careful cattle sales and Thad's honest forage wages both, pooled together in a way that had stopped feeling, by that point, like 2 separate accounts belonging to 2 separate people.
Mr. Whitfield processed the paperwork with visible satisfaction, adjusting his spectacles twice to reread the final total before stamping it, the old wooden clock on his office wall ticking loudly through the silence while he worked, telling me, as he stamped the final document, that in 30 years of foreclosure auctions, he had seen exactly one redemption completed on time, and that he had privately hoped, from the moment Thad outbid Coyle on that courthouse lawn, that he would live to see a second. What Thad asked me that same evening, standing at the corral fence where I had once told him plainly that I did not want charity, the same weathered rail where Samuel's old hat still hung after 18 months, was not whether he could keep working the ranch for wages, though that would have been reasonable enough given everything the year had built between us. He asked, instead, in that same unhurried voice he used for everything, turning to face me fully with his hands loose at his sides, rather than in his pockets, the evening light catching the small burn scar on his forearm the way it always seemed to at that particular hour. Whether I might consider a different kind of partnership than the one the redemption law had accidentally arranged for us, one that did not expire after a single year and did not require either of us to keep separate account of who had paid for what. I told him the ranch had never really felt like mine alone, not since the day he raised his hand against Jasper Coyle's bid without knowing the first thing about running cattle, a fact he had confessed to me only weeks after that first auction, laughing quietly at his own ignorance in a way that had somehow made me trust him more rather than less, and that if he was asking what I thought he was asking, the answer had probably been forming me since sometime around the winter evening he told me about his mother's farm, though I had been too stubborn to say so out loud until he asked properly. I told him, too, that I had caught myself, more than once over the preceding months, setting 2 cups out for coffee before I had even consciously decided he would be staying for supper, a small habit that had crept in so quietly I had not noticed it becoming permanent until I tried, one evening, to imagine going back to setting out only 1. He did not have a ring to offer me that evening, only calloused hands and a burn scar, and 6 years of savings he had spent entirely on a debt that was never truly his to pay, standing there in the fading light with the same steady, unhurried patience he had shown me from the very first afternoon on the courthouse lawn. And I told him plainly that I did not need a ring so much as I needed a partner who understood the difference between rescuing a woman and simply staying beside her while she saved herself, and that he had proven, over 1 long, careful year, to be exactly that.
Samuel's hat still hangs on that same corral fence today, faded now to a paler gray than it once was, the brim gone soft and worn from 2 full years of weather. Thad has never once suggested I take it down, and some mornings I catch him nodding to it briefly, the way one working man acknowledges another before he gets on with the day's chores. Mr. Whitfield officiated our wedding himself the following spring, an unusual role for a bank manager to take on, but he had grown fond enough of the whole story by then that he asked the circuit preacher's permission to say a few words before the ceremony proper began. Something about redemption clauses and second chances that made half the small gathering laugh and the other half reach quietly for a handkerchief. We held it on the ranch itself, under the same cottonwood where Samuel was buried, not out of any morbid instinct, but because it seemed dishonest to pretend that piece of ground could be separated from anything else that happened on the Circle W, joy included. Thad wore a clean shirt he had pressed himself, badly, and I noticed him glance once toward the grave marker before the preacher began, a small private acknowledgement that I understood better than words could have explained. Jasper Coyle did not attend, of course, though I heard secondhand some months later that his consolidation scheme along the Verde had finally begun to collapse under its own weight, 3 of the outfits he had stripped and left to rot changing hands again at auctions he no longer bothered to attend himself. I felt less satisfaction in that news than I might have expected a year earlier, which I have come to think says less about forgiveness
and more about how thoroughly my attention had shifted toward building something rather than watching an old enemy lose.
We expanded the herd that second year, modestly, buying back some of the breeding stock Samuel had once hoped to build the ranch around before the drought and his death had scattered those plans along with everything else. Thad kept the small forge behind the barn even after we no longer needed the extra income, mending our own tools and, more often than not, tools brought out by neighboring ranchers who had heard there was a blacksmith worth the ride now settled permanently in the county. I watched him turn away payment from more than one hard-up neighbor over those years, quietly, the same way he had once quietly bought back a stranger's future on a courthouse lawn, and I stopped being surprised by it, though I never once stopped noticing. Mr. Whitfield still tells the story of our redemption to new widows who come through his office frightened and certain they have no options left, using it, he told me once, not as a promise that a stranger will always appear to bid against the Jasper Coils of the world, but as proof that the law itself sometimes holds more mercy in it than people expect, if only someone takes the trouble to go looking for it. I think of that whenever I ride past the old courthouse steps, worn smoother now by another decade of boots climbing them toward better and worse news in equal measure. Samuel's hat has finally begun to come apart at the brim, weather having done what 2 years of my own reluctance never could, and last autumn I finally took it down, not out of any lessened love for him, but because I had, at last, made my peace with the fact that a hat hanging on a fence was never really where he lived in me anyway. Thad helped me choose a small shadow box for it, something to hang inside by the hearth instead, and he never once suggested I explain the choice to him, understanding, as he always had, that some kinds of love simply move rooms rather than leaving the house altogether. She never told him the ranch was his to share. She simply stopped calling it mine alone and started, instead, calling it ours. First in small, unthinking moments, and then, eventually, without any hesitation at all.